Dear students, in the year 1991, an eminent Supreme Court lawyer and a notable environmentalist named M.C. Mehta filed a public interest litigation before the Honorable Supreme Court of India. His prayer to the court was to provide provision for compulsory environmental education to the students of schools and colleges throughout the country. The Supreme Court considered the PIL favorably and subsequently gave directions to central and state governments for the compulsory introduction of environmental education to both school and college curricula. Since then, the implementation of this Supreme Court order was in motion and at various stages of its development, which finally culminated in May 2019, whereby University Grants Commission, the UGC, had asked all the universities and colleges across India to introduce environmental studies as a compulsory 6-month course for all undergraduate students from 2019 academic year onwards. As a result of the implementation of this course in 2019, around 1.5 to 2 lakh undergraduate students are now taking up this course, in which they are being taught about their environment, the ecosystem, environmental pollution, and various socio-political issues related to the environment. A small portion of this environmental studies syllabus has been entirely devoted to learn the meaning, importance, and various aspects related to human rights, which is the topic for discussion in this class, an introduction to human rights. Human rights. As Indians, when we talk about human rights, I think we should start from our father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi. He was one of the greatest champions of human rights the world has ever seen. We all know the contributions of Gandhiji in shaping the destiny of India. He fought for the rights of the children, women, and the oppressed. And we can say that the entire Indian freedom struggle, the Indian national movement led by Gandhi against the British rule, was to get the right to freedom for each and every Indian. And we know that right to freedom and right to freedom of expression are fundamental human rights. Gandhiji and his principles continue to remain as a source of inspiration for movements of non-violence, civil rights, and freedom across the world. Other than Gandhiji, there are several other luminaries who fought valiantly for the cause of human rights. To name a few, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Eleanor Roosevelt, Muhammad Yunus, and even the youngest Nobel laureate, Malala Yousafzai, they all contributed and they stood for the cause of human rights from different parts of the world and at different times of the human history. When we think about the historical development of human rights, it is believed that human rights are evolved from the concept of natural law. Natural law. Natural law എന്നത് മലയാളത്തിൽ പ്രകൃതി നിയമം എന്നോ സ്വാഭാവിക നിയമം എന്നൊക്കെ വ്യാഖ്യാനിക്കാം. But anyway, this natural law was based on a standard of higher order morality, and all other laws or customs which were practiced in the early societies were associated with this natural law. And these natural laws were unwritten laws, and they mainly derived from the nature of things. And in some instances, this natural law was even attributed to the greater authority of God or supernatural powers. And the influence of this natural law were more dominant in the Western political societies for centuries. But eventually, this natural law was evolved into what we call as natural rights. Natural rights. So from natural law to natural rights. So this change from natural law to natural rights also emphasized a shift in perspective from society to individual. As we all know that a law is more applicable to a group of person or society, whereas a right is more applicable to an individual or a person. So the natural law provided a basis for curbing or preventing the excessive powers of the state over society, whereas natural rights gave the individuals ability to claim for their rights against the governments or authorities. So later, as a result of the contributions of several great thinkers or philosophers, revolutions, Renaissance and Enlightenment, which primarily took place in the Western political societies like England, France and the US, these natural rights were further evolved into what we now call human rights. Human rights. So this was the evolution of human rights, that is from the primitive natural law to the natural rights and the modern human rights. There are several thinkers and philosophers who have greatly influenced this process of evolution of human rights. And one notable among them would be John Locke. John Locke, who proposed the theory of classical liberalism, and he is widely regarded as the father of liberalism. John Locke has contributed in many ways, but the most important contribution of John Locke towards the development of human rights was through his ideas on liberalism. He helped to foster a new way of thinking about the individuals and the governments and the rights that connects these two important components of the society. But human rights in the modern coded legal form, that is in the form of a written document, may have its origin in the 13th century, the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta of 1215. We all know, or we all have studied about Magna Carta in our school history textbooks. But Magna Carta is considered as a milestone in the human history because it provided a foundation for the development of individual rights. It provided a foundation for individual rights. Next recorded milestone in the development of human rights was Petition of Rights in 1628. And Petition of Rights was a statement of civil liberties sent by the British Parliament to the king or the monarch. I think the king at that time was Charles I. Then came the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. And philosophically, this American Declaration of Independence mainly stressed on two aspects. They are individual rights and the right of revolution. And American Declaration of Independence was followed by the Constitution of America in 1787. And American Constitution is the oldest constitution in the world, and it categorically defined the basic rights of citizens. Then came the French Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights in 1789, and French Declaration was in fact a proclamation of rights of the citizens, and it also presented the famous slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which later on inspired many people throughout the world. Then came the first Geneva Convention in 1864, which also contributed to its part to the development of human rights. And finally, after the aftermath of Second World War, the United Nations came into existence in October 24th of 1945. And in United Nations, under the dynamic leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, which was adopted by the United Nations on December 10th of 1948. And this is the reason why we celebrate International Day of Human Rights on December 10th every year. Now you may ask, what are human rights? The classic definition of a human right is that these are a set of universal moral rights, something which all human beings everywhere at any time ought to have, something of which no one may be deprived without a grave offense to the law, something which is owing to every human being simply because he or she is a human. This is the classic definition of human rights. In other words, human rights involves the basic needs of a human, and they establish the basic standards to lead a life or to lead a human life with dignity. So in essence, human rights provide dignity, respect, freedom, social justice, and so on. And further, human rights are universal, they are inalienable, indivisible, and they are all interdependent. In the year 1979, one of the distinguished human rights scholar named Karl Vasek, he was a Czech jurist. He introduced the idea of 3 generations of human rights. Here I use the word types or categories instead of generations in order to better understand the concept, because both these have the same meaning here. The basis of this categorization of human rights was the 3 tenets of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And Vasek considered these 3 tenets, liberty, equality, and fraternity, are the pillars of any human rights consideration. So these are the 3 pillars on which these 3 generations of human rights were classified by Karl Vasek. And as such, he classified or he categorized human rights into 3 categories. They are human rights of the first generation, human rights of the second generation, and human rights of the third generation. The first generation of human rights are also known as civil political rights. Civil political rights, and they are collectively known as liberty-oriented rights. Liberty-oriented rights, because these rights mainly emphasize on individual liberties, which enable free participation in political and civic life. Further, these civil political rights reflect long established human values, and most of these rights are now incorporated into the constitutions of several countries, including Indian Constitution. And they also form major part of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. And some of the examples of civil political rights include right to life, right to freedom of expression, conscience, beliefs, and right against slavery, and so on. These are some of the examples of civil political rights. The second generation of human rights are also known as socio-economic rights. Socio-economic rights, and they are collectively known as equality-oriented rights. Equality-oriented rights. In essence, these socio-economic rights seek to guarantee equal conditions or treatment for all people. Further, these rights are demanding in nature to the government or the state to meet or create certain conditions for the fulfillment of some basic needs of the human in order to live a human life with dignity. Examples of socio-economic rights include some of the social needs such as shelter, health, clean water, education, social infrastructure, and so on. Coming to the third generation of human rights, it is also known as collective developmental rights. Collective developmental rights, or they are also known as cultural rights. Cultural rights. And these collective developmental rights or cultural rights constitute a broad class of rights mainly found in international treaties and agreements. And unlike the other two categories of human rights, these cultural rights do not have a legal status, and as such they are aspirational, and hence they are also known as soft laws. They are also known as soft laws. Examples of collective developmental rights include international agreements, environmental laws, right to peace, and right of linguistic and cultural communities. But one interesting aspect of this cultural rights is that they mainly emphasize on sustainable development and the rights of the future generations. So broadly, these are the three categories or generations of human rights proposed by Karl Wassak in 1979. Dear students, respect the values of human rights, respect the rights of your neighbor, and be a guardian of your nature, as we have an inherent responsibility to preserve the nature for the future generations so that we can make a better world to live for you, for me, and for the entire humanity.